It's 5 to 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone.
Well, hello and welcome to Islands at War with myself, Keith Bengelli, and also in the company, of course, with
Nick Lahire. Hi, Keith. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. Well, we're up to March 1942, and as ever, plenty going on, especially in a big subject to cover up, which we'll talk about later, but when Guernsey police were involved in a scandal. That's a big subject. You'll be making reference to it later on, but we'll trawl through as we normally do. We start with food. Food, always a big subject.
Yes.
And our, Guernsey Press correspondent of latter years that collected a lot of stories together from the Guernsey Press, Herbie Winterflood, the late Herbie, talks about limpet gatherers were out in force on Belgrave Bay. Now, this is a bay that's just north of St. Peter Port, going up to the north of the island. So Belgrave not mined.
No, it wasn't mined, but they had enough fortifications along there that, you wouldn't need it to be mined, really. In fact, if you go, for those of you who are on the island, if you're driving to work in the morning and you work in St. Peter Port and you go past Admiral Park and the bus stop on the left, you can see the remains of a machine gun position just there in the wall. There's a concrete machine gun position.
Yeah, there's quite a few little artifacts along there. In fact, there's a position halfway between St. Peter Port and the bridge, which is the northern town, called imaginatively the halfway, but there's a big bus shelter there, and I think there's still German road markings have been evidenced and renovated.
Yeah, they've been preserved. They're actually behind perspex now. But yeah, we talked about this in an earlier episode. The Germans, to be able to find their way around, they had colour-coded roads and numbered roads because they just wouldn't have been able to find their way around otherwise. So those are there. There's also some of those actually down on the bridge near almost opposite HSBC. There's that tiny little building there that's got some of those markings that have been preserved as well. For those of you that are in Guernsey, a lot of point is listening. That's how they found the round. There's some outside the Cock and Bull, although partially obscured by a lamp post these days, but you can still see those there. But yeah, the machine gun position along the seafront there is literally right next to the bus shelter. And of course, there's the one opposite island coachways. There's a big bunker there as well. Yeah. And as you can imagine, being just outside our capital town in Guernsey, heavily fortified by the Germans. Okay, moving on. Sawdust, Nick. Owners of sawdust ovens were now available. Sawdust was available for the owners of sawdust ovens from a company I'd not heard of, Western Counties in the Shropshire. This is just the suburbs of St. Peter Port. And I looked in an almanac for 1940, and there they were. Western Counties Association was an agricultural and horticultural supplier. And a bit like in latter years, fruit export and brewards, etc., merchants that would have been supporting the agriculture and horticultural industries. So the sawdust was damp and it could be used in a sawdust oven, which in fact was a converted biscuit tin. I was going to say, owners of sawdust ovens sounds quite, I've got a sawdust. Do you want to come and see my sawdust oven? It's a biscuit tin.
Yeah, Huntley and Palmer's biscuit tin.
Yeah, exactly. To be fair, at least biscuit tins were a bit bigger in those days than they are now. Otherwise, you'd have been in bother.
They were. In fact, my grandmother had them. She must have sort of picked them up in the sort of 50s, and I remember these huge great things in her pantry. And of course, you're building an oven to cook limpets in, presumably smoked limpet. I mean, probably Hester Blumenthal will have that sort of like 60 quid a portion or something.
It'd take an absolute age to cook anything in one of those, wouldn't it?
Well, I suppose people had people had time on their hands and everything, necessity is the mother of invention and all of that.
Yeah, I suppose.
Sawdust oven. I don't know if there's any in the museums over here. Has Richard Hume got one?
I don't remember seeing one, but it's been a while since I've been up there, and every time I go to the museum, Richard's always got something new that he's put out on display, either from his store or just that he's picked up somewhere along the way. So always worth a visit if you're in Guernsey.
Okay, moving on with Herbie again. Herbert wanted flood. 30 men were wanted to work in Alderney, to labour on the land, single men preferred. As an employee of the state's controlling committee, so these men would have been working for Guernsey employers, not the German forces, not directly. The pay was set at 30 Reichsmarks a week. Accommodation would be free, but the workers would be expected to contribute to the costs of the wages of the Alderney cook. And then it further goes on to say, one experienced man was also required to oversee land cultivation project. The idea was to grow further crops in order to supplement those grown on Guernsey. So, Nick, we always hear about this huge fortress that is Alderney. But so in 1942, in March 1942, what was actually going on in Alderney?
So they were, as you said there, they were trying to use Alderney effectively as like a giant allotment.
Yes,
for Guernsey in order to generate more food for the civilian population. So that's why these men were being employed by the government here and not by the Germans. And they were trying to grow crops up there. And that went on, throughout the occupation, although it started to tail off later on, just purely because of difficulties in getting.
Yeah, okay, so presumably, they're advertising for these men. Presumably these men were found, and this actually happened. So at some point in Alderney, were these men removed prior to the building of the camps that we hear so much about?
No, the camps had already been built. So the camps were built and brought into service in January 42. So they'd have been open for a couple of months. But these were growing crops in other areas of Alderney. But it went on at varying levels throughout the occupation, going back to even as early as December 1940. There was a work party up there. I think we talked about it in the December 40 episode, or even the January 41.
So for how long then were Guernsey men being sent to Alderney to work? Not right through the war, surely.
Yeah, I think pretty much they were. Although obviously things got more difficult after D-Day, so probably not to a certain extent.
Okay, but certainly into 1944, because there's a sort of a supposition that all these nefarious goings on in Alderney, there were no witnesses. Having people on the island of Alderney from Guernsey, if there had been a lot of what is hinted at by certain dubious historians, shall we say, the Guernsey people that were there would have noticed a lot of what was going on.
Correct. Yeah. So, as I say, I haven't got the stats for exactly when they stopped doing the cultivation up there, but from memory, I think it's around early 44.
Well, any Guernsey-based, or any listeners that have any information about members of their family that would have worked up in Alderney, maybe diaries, letters, etc., we'd be very interested to see that, wouldn't we, Nick?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are a few books around from people that, well, they're more like pamphlets, really, who've recorded what their experiences were like doing that. But it wasn't unusual, because the problem that they had, and as I said, it got less and less in Alderney in terms of what they were doing up there in terms of cultivation as time went on, because they had exactly the same problems we had here. The Germans were building over everything.
Yeah.
And it's not just the site of your gun battery or whatever that takes over some of your land that you were growing crops on. It's the fact that it then becomes a military area. You're not allowed into it. So then you've got a whole much wider area around that where you can't grow your crops. You do get the strange situation as well where, the Germans are warned when they start putting the wooden stakes in the fields because they're worried about gliders or parachutists landing. They've got mines attached to those with wires, and they have to start warning farmers not to let their cows go into those fields because, what will happen? The cow brushes against one of the wires and bang, off goes the mine. So again, that's reducing the amount of space for growing crops, etc. So not only were they nicking food from the civilian supply for their own purposes, or rather borrowing for their own purposes. We've talked about the problem of them borrowing potato supplies numerous times when they don't actually give them back. so that was compounding it as well, was the fact that you're just losing out on agricultural land.
Okay, so I noticed this the next thing I'm going to talk about caught my attention and piqued my interest. We know that boxing was very big on the island, and a tournament was arranged for the end of March 1942 at the Regal Cinema, which was the Odeon.
Yes.
It was the Odeon later on, it's no longer there. And the big draw was a young New Zealander called Brian Porritt, who would be appearing again. And I wondered who Porritt was, being a New Zealander. And I thought, surely he must have been deported, because we'll get onto this later in 1942, and then also in 1943. Non-Guernsey-born people were deported. And I thought, well, New Zealander must have had a New Zealand passport. Interested to know how he turned up on the island, but I thought surely he must have been deported. So I asked someone to do a little bit of research for me at Guernsey Museum, and there's a big notice board up there in the museum, Nick, with the names of everybody that was deported.
Yeah, and they've got a brilliant thing of caricatures up there as well for some of the people, sort of more well-known people as well. So that's worth seeing. In fact, I'm popping up there this afternoon. I mentioned it to you just before, didn't I?
Yeah, and so the person that had a look for me said, yeah, Brian Porritt, his name was there, so he was deported to Loughton, one of the camps. And I think I'm going to sort of delve, Nick, into this gentleman's life, see if I can sort of track him down, what became of him.
New rabbit hole for you.
Another rabbit hole, yeah. Brian Porritt, did he go back to New Zealand?
You found this other thing as well, this Mr. Kin in your almanac, and I've had a jolly good look, and all I can think is that that's actually a typo, because
yes,
there was a grower called Lynn, and I just think that it must have been a typo in the almanac. Unfortunately, I can't find the advert that it refers to. I don't have a copy of the press with that.
Well, well, Mr. Lynn, let's say it's Mr. Lynn. because they call him Mr. L. Kidd, and I think you're right. I think it's Mr. Lynn in the forest area. This is a parish near the airport. He was looking for 25 men to work on his land. So again, that's another little thing that I'm going to try and follow up on. Lynn is not being a Guernsey name, but yeah, that's another rabbit hole, as Nick quite rightly says. Also, in terms of people trying to attract young men, or not so young men, was the police force. There'd been an upsurge because of the many shortages. There was a huge increase in crime. Guernsey police were looking to introduce auxiliary officers, like special constables, into the force, and a preference will be given to men aged between 20 and 50 who were in possession of a bicycle, or at least served previously as a special constable. So those interested were to apply to Deputy Inspector A.J. Langmead, a person that will feature in episodes to come. He'd been involved with my family, and he was deported later on, but interesting character. So, Nick, this is an interesting month because, well, first of all, I think you'd like to talk about the increase in crime. You've got some examples, but there was a really big sort of kerfuffle with Guernsey police. So this seems to be a good time to introduce that. Yeah,
sure. We'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, just going back to the crime was rapidly increasing just because people were getting desperate. And it was Germans, it was local people, it was slave workers as well that were, trying to get food. And so, the last month we talked about, the bakery being robbed by somebody using
a pointed sticks
to break in and steal stuff off the shelves, and somebody's van having a hole cut in the roof.
Yeah, we go back to February 42.
Stuff like that. So the crime was a big problem, and Ambrose Robin reports at the start of March that he was at home one day, and 3 times during the course of the day, Germans tried the back door of his house, obviously trying to get in to try and steal stuff. But
so this is actually German military, trying to enter for purposes of crime.
Yeah. And his dog Tim scared them off by barking at them. Probably if it'd been later on in the war, they'd have probably tried to get in to get the dog.
Yeah, soft dog.
So there had been, the crime wasn't on the increase. So much so that the Germans actually suggested to Guernsey police that they should be armed.
Oh, so the Germans suggested to the Guernsey constabulary that police officers should be armed.
Yeah, they turned them down. They didn't want to be armed, which is, obviously a fairly difficult decision for them to make. Do they want to be armed or not? Traditionally, they'd never been armed, so they turned it down. But you could see potentially why they might have said yes, because there were, later on there were crimes committed by Germans who were armed at the time. And there's a gentleman who was killed trying to stop. But later on in the war, trying to stop them from.
Well, that's in the King's Mills area, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
and that's right. We'll cover that off in due course.
I suppose we better get on to the elephant in the room.
Oh, well, sorry. Actually, can I mention Mr. Duckman down at Le Grand Mare?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there was Mr. Steve Duckman of Le Grand Mare, which is being converted at the moment to this huge, great big golf course. He was offering £20 reward for information that led to the conviction of those who may have entered a store and harness room and taken 2 bikes, rubber boots, clothing and other items. And Mr. Duckman was the well-known owner of the race course he had established at Le Grand Mare. So there you go, local people. We had a racetrack down at the Grand Mare.
Yeah, I never knew that. Actually.
No. So Mr. Steve Duckman. So let's hope he had a little bit of...
I'll tell you what, the going must have been a bit wet underfoot.
Well, that's what I was thinking.
Wet underfoot at times, because for those of you who are listening and not familiar with that part of the island, the Grand Mare is quite... Well, it literally means the big marsh. And it is very low-lying. It's below sea level. It's just in from Varzon Bay. It's a great little golf course to go and play on. It's currently being completely redone, but it does flood an awful lot. It's got lots of dwits going through it.
Yeah, dwits, Guernsey French for stream. As you say, Nick, it is marshy. And in fact, it's not for this podcast, but for another one to do with Napoleonic War. There was a plan there to utilise those marshes if the French ever came, but that's a whole new.
That sounds interesting. I look forward to hearing about that.
Yeah,
but yeah. So I can't, and they must have built up some of it to make it viable as a race course, because sometimes it's very soggy down there.
Yeah. Well, let's hope Mr. Duckman had some, as I say, some. Well, did he ever have to pay out his £20? We'll perhaps never know. Yes, Nick. Okay, now, as you say, elephant in the room, the Guernsey Police. This is an issue that needs, just so the listener is aware, it is an issue that needs a lot of sensitivity. It echoes down the ages. There's a lot of controversy now. There are people alive whose grandfathers were involved in some way. So off you go, Nick. Give our listeners a bit of background to this.
Yeah, I think this is a vast subject, and I think we'll do a special on this one, because
I think so. Yeah,
we could easily talk for a whole hour about this. As you say, it's still a live issue because there are people campaigning for these guns to get their names cleared, but it's a legal minefield, which again is probably why it's a good idea to get somebody in who knows what they're talking about when it comes to the law, etc. So essentially, what happened? We're talking about crime waves increasing. Well, there were some thefts of food from a German store by constables Kingston Bailey and Frank Tuck. And then Bailey actually notes in his memoir that it started to get out of hand and practically the entire police force was involved, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. Now, the controversial bit is that it is alleged by some that some of the stuff that they took was civilian supplies, not just German supplies. So there are some that portray them as being effectively Robin Hood, steal from the Germans to give to locals. Others who say, hang on a minute, I think they took some of the civilian supplies. I'm not going to go into that now. That's part of the biggest subject. But it is interesting when Kingston Bailey notes in his memoir, we started doing this and then it got out of hand. Unfortunately for them, on the 3rd of March 1942, some German soldiers were laying in wait. The Germans had twigged that this was going on. And subsequent to that, 5th of March, the entire police force was arrested. Now, it's not often that sort of thing happens. So they ended up with 20 the Guernsey prison had 20 police officers locked up in the prison. Inspector Sculper, who's in charge of the police force, albeit he wasn't involved in any of the stealing, but the Germans said, well, you were in charge of this lot, so you're going
guilty by implication.
You're off to prison as well. So they ended up in prison for quite a while, and there was a big court case which went on for quite a while. Only 17 of them out of the 20 got as far as being taken to court. And it's interesting as well for other reasons. So Frank Fuller, who we talked about previously, who managed one of the newspapers here, the court case was being held in camera, and the Germans really didn't want anybody reporting on what was going on in this trial. And Frank actually managed to get 1,500 copies of the Guernsey Press out with the story in it before the Germans cottoned on and threatened to lock him up, because one of the unauthorised copies was purchased by a German who was sitting on the bench for the trial. So what are the chances of that happening?
Yeah.
Anyway, he wasn't very happy. So yeah, so the story goes on. They get sent. Some of them get sent to Germany. Some of them are imprisoned here. Some of their families get deported later on in 1943 for military reasons, in inverted commas, but it's just purely because they were connected to
and
people.
Their houses, police constables' houses were raided, and they found tins of food stuck up in the chimney. I read one report where they unearthed newly planted cabbage plants and found tin food buried in the garden. It seems that the Germans knew quite a lot of what was going on and let it play out before pouncing.
Yeah, I think you're right there. They just wanted to make sure that they had as much evidence as possible. I've got a couple of articles that I wrote about this that are on island-fortress.com. If you just use the search box on that, you can find them. Now, I'm not normally a fan of cartoons about history, but when on one of those articles on there, I've got a link to a brilliant little YouTube video. It's about 10 minutes long, something like that, where somebody rather creatively has done a cartoon, basically, that explains the whole story.
Oh, right. I didn't know.
It's really quite cool. I'll send you the link after.
Yes.
Keith, it's quite...
Can we tweet that out?
Yeah, and we can put that out.
Yep.
I must admit, I saw it on YouTube, and I thought, oh God, this is going to be absolutely awful. And then it was just kind of morbid curiosity. I'll have a look at it and see just how bad this is. And actually, it's on the money. It's a really good explanation of it, and it's done in quite a fun way. And it's suitable for adults or kids.
So can I just ask who was, if you like, if the Guernsey police were all locked up and understandably wouldn't have been asked to investigate themselves, who was doing the investigating? This was German military?
Yeah, German. It was
Gestapo?
Well, no, what everybody called the Gestapo, but wasn't the...
Yes, that's right.
So it's the German Field Police, the GFP, or Geheimfeldpolizei, something like that. I've probably murdered that in German, were they civilian police, German civilian police, or were they sort of co-opted into the military? No, they're part of they're attached to the German army, basically.
Okay, so an adjunct to the German military.
Yeah, now they walked around in civilian clothes predominantly. Didn't necessarily wear uniforms, although they did from time to time. As said, they were referred to as the Gestapo by the locals frequently, but weren't actually the Gestapo. I think you could quite safely say they aspired to be the Gestapo in some cases. There was a chap called Wolf whose nickname was Wolf of the Gestapo, because he used to like playing up to the fact that and pretending that he was the Gestapo. There's no doubt that they used some of the similar techniques to extract information out of people, so you definitely wouldn't have wanted to fall into their hands, I don't think.
Okay, so big subject. So I think we'll work up a special at the appropriate time.
Yeah, absolutely. As I say, there's still legal wrangling going on about clearing their names, because it's a very complicated issue because of the legal system at the time, where the laws here were being approved by the Germans, not being approved by by the Privy Council or the king. So it's kind of the law's the law. Theft was illegal. Well, I mean, where do you go with it? It's a really, really difficult subject.
Yeah. Okay, well, we will return to it from time to time, monthly, but also we will look up a special. Okay, Guernsey, excuse me, in Jersey had a visitor, Dr. Hans Auerbach, the well-known German historian and philosopher. He was again visiting Guernsey, getting data for another book on the Channel Islands. He'd already written one, and it had sold out. So what was this book all about then? For the German home market, was it?
It was predominantly aimed at the troops. Really, it was like a tour guide. You used to go and buy.
If you're short of somewhere to invade next year, what about the Channel Islands?
Have you considered invading the Channel Islands? Yeah, it literally was. So, and it was just basically called the Channel Islands in German. I can't pronounce it. But basically, it was called the Channel Islands. The first one was published in 1942 by this Dr. Hans Ulbrich. That was commissioned by the commander of the Jersey forces, and it sold out pretty quickly. The author held the designation Sonderführer, meaning special leader, and that was kind of a specialist role intended for the mobilization of the German army, involving the exploitation of non-military personnel in the fields of interpretation of places, engineering, construction, that kind of stuff, finance and admin, science and infrastructure, that sort of stuff. It was 138 pages long.
So it's a sort of interpretation pamphlet. Yeah, orientation pamphlet.
The 1942 equivalent of Lonely Planet or something, or something like that. We were trying to find out a little bit more about him actually from Jersey Archives, because they've got some stuff there, but they've had a bit of an IT issue this week, which is
did you find that? I found that.
They had a little banner thing on their website saying they were having problems. So. I think that's now fixed, because I looked last night, but yeah, that was causing a few problems in terms of finding things. We've been a bit unlucky, actually. There's been obviously there's the scheduled closure of the Prio. They're now back open. I spent a whole day there last Saturday doing some research, both for the podcast and from a book. They're now back open, but unfortunately the Island Archives here in Guernsey has had to close unexpectedly for some maintenance work, and they're not reopening until March, so I can't remember exactly when in March. And Jersey Archives have been having an IT issue, so between if you've been trying to do any research.
Yeah, and I'd only just joined Jersey Archive, got my code number, and then
it is brilliant.
I found I couldn't get in.
It is a brilliant resource so far. I think is it 20 quid for a year? Something like that.
I think it was 40 or
something like that. It's not massively expensive, and you can access any of the digitized stuff that they've got. You can go and look at it. It's brilliant.
Well, of course, Guernsey's records are going to be available to anybody around the world online from April. I was talking to Steve Foote, who's CEO. CEO of the Prio Library. The pricing structure he gave me made me raise my eyebrows, but I think he's working on that. Okay. But as he points out, it's the amount of material that will be available online is far greater than what is online at Jersey. So hey ho, but for people like Nick and I that are addicted to delving in archives, and
it's just the ability to be able to. It's the ability to be able to word search stuff just to find things, because otherwise you could be there for, unless you've got a date, you could be there forever trying to find stuff.
Yeah, what a way to spend a day. Returning,
I mean, it's a great place to go. I thoroughly, if you are in Guernsey or find yourself in Guernsey, I thoroughly recommend going to the Prio. Just have a look around the building. If nothing else, it's a fantastic building. They've got some beautiful fireplaces and just nice paintings on the walls, and some lovely old furniture. I was sat upstairs and looking out the window. There's a lovely old desk just in front of the window looking out over Candy Gardens. It's all very pleasant. I was chucking it down with rain as well, so I didn't really feel like I wanted to leave, to be honest.
I think that the ashes of Mr. Prio are actually in a casket or something on the fireplace, aren't they?
Quite probably, quite possibly. I'll have a look next time I'm up there. But I thoroughly recommend a visit. It's totally free to join. You can borrow some of the books. Obviously, some of the rarer stuff you can't, but it is available for reference, and they've got lots and lots of stuff there.
Okay. Again, we return to Reverend Ord, Methodist minister that elected to stay on the island. He was a fluent German speaker and made friends with many German officers. When I say made friends, they approached him. One in particular was a young Reverend Bodecker, who was a German minister, and Ord records him. And this is March 42, and Bodecker was unlike most of the Germans that Ord had met, and Bodecker, sees what Ord describes as coming judgment in the not too distant future, and I think this is on the back of the Germans having invaded Russia. Things weren't going very well at all, and I think more independent thinking German officers were starting to hint to Ord that they were backing the wrong horse. And this is early in the war. This is still, March 1942.
Yeah, we're getting consistent messages as well from our diarist Lesotho over in Jersey as well. He's talks in March 42 about disenchanted German officers. It's all very familiar stories. They're talking about, they've been on leave and they're worried about their families because they spent most of their leave in air raid shelters or spent a large part of their leave trying to get to or from visiting their families. Now, Ord, we probably should remind people, for him to be able to talk to these Germans, he actually was a German speaker. He'd been a prisoner of war in the First World War. I think he was a POW from 1916 from memory. So yeah, he could obviously speak to these people in German, and also he did like to earwig, because we talked in another episode about how he caught some Germans out because they were talking about him in German without realising that he could understand absolutely everything they were saying.
Yeah, that's right. He writes at one stage about walking up Monument Hill towards Victoria Tower, and some submariners were behind him, talking away in German and obviously ripping Ord's appearance. And Ord turned around and spoke to him in German, and they were most chagrined, because I think they thought he was going to turn them in.
Just to looking at our notes here as well, where you're talking about Bodecker, this German who was talking to Ord, was convinced that the British would soon raid the island. Well, there were a lot of exercises going on in both here, and Lesotho refers to it in his Jersey diary in March 42 that the Germans are out practicing at all hours, firing guns. He does say, unfortunately, blanks, because I think he was rather hoping that they'd shoot each other. But they were out at all hours causing hassle and stuff like that. And then I've read other accounts, of the Germans basically just running through people's houses in the middle of the night because they were out wargaming their stuff. And I know you've talked about somebody that who had that.
Yes, my father remembers them just bustling through the house with, being a child, what he remembered is that they had big pieces of branches and looked like bushes on their heads, because this was the camouflage they'd stuck in their helmet netting. And it's the sort of thing a child would remember. One of our other diarists, Violet Carey, writes about the huge camps of huts being set up at the Vauberlay and at Rosenheim. Rosenheim would be behind the chain house in St Andrews, for people that know the area. And Violet writes that each hut houses 120 persons, Spaniards, French, Belgians, Dutch, Japanese, and Chinese, all mixed up. I think we do know that there was at least one Chinaman that had been caught up in the slave workers, and he I think, had come through the French army because of their colonial connections, but I doubt if we had a Japanese person here.
That's the first time I've heard of that.
What, the Japanese person?
Yeah.
I think I can imagine some French colonial troops, Indo-Chinese, Vietnamese. This is before the formation of Vietnam, but some of those were swept up with Algerians, for example.
Yeah. And that camp ran all the way to, if you're familiar with the lane by Blancheland, where there's, I can't remember which There's a place there where they store trucks and
that's
and
Froomes.
diggers. Yeah, Froomes, opposite Froomes there, it ran all the way up to that lane. The reason I know is my maternal grandparents lived on that road for a while. When they moved in there when I was a teenager, we were rototilling the back garden, and we came across some concrete foundations, which it turned out were part of the foundations for the huts.
Yes, and Violet mentions the house Rosenheim, and that Rosenheim was the chain house. That had been owned by the Henderson family and had been sold off by them. Had a name change to Plenov Court. But the Henderson family are interesting because this is the family of Elsie Henderson, the artist who'd married the French consul, Baron de Coudenhove, Henri de Coudenhove, and she was here during the occupation. She's mentioned peripherally in some diaries, but her own wartime journals, Nick, have now been placed in Cambridge University, and hopefully I have been assured by the representations or the representatives of the Henderson family that the wartime journals will be fast-tracked to the Prio Library in the summer.
Excellent.
And we should be able to have a look at those.
I've just remembered something. The camp there was called Utah.
Yes, and the wash blocks are still across the road and down that lane. If they're all covered in ivy, I think, now.
Oh, quite possibly, yeah.
Yeah. So that's the opposite side, the same side as Froomes. So if you're passing through there, and you always wondered what that sort of building, or the remains of a building, those were the wash blocks for the camp there. Moving on to more, again, military matters. This again is Ord. The naval commandant and his staff now billeted next to Ord, and this is in the Rohays, Nick.
Yeah, so this obviously is before they built the Navy Signals bunker in St Jack's.
But the naval signals was in the hotel,
it was
Colonet, which is very close.
Yeah, which is very close by. Because when I read this to start off with, I was like, hang on a second. How can the naval commandant have moved in next door to Ord? Because Ord lived in a house called Shelton, which was the manse, which was in the Rohays. I'm like, hang on, what's going on here? And then I twigged, hang on a minute, it's before they built the bunker. So, because for listeners, later on, the naval commander was in the house basically across the road from the Colonet Hotel and across the road from the bunker. So I was a bit confused to start off with. I was like, hang on, did Ord move around or something like that? But no, he didn't. He was in the Rohays the whole time.
And in fact, I think it's behind his property, or the property he lived in. There's that field, and there's some recent controversy about the bombs that were dropped and are still there. That's not far away.
Yeah, no, it isn't. No, it's kind of in a It could. There was speculation that raid was potentially to attack the naval headquarters. Who knows?
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, given the accuracy of bombing at the time, it could be a time.
Well, I think we established they were bombs that had just been jettisoned and sunk into the earth.
We're not entirely sure, but yeah, I mean, given the accuracy of bombing, they could have been trying to hit anything.
Okay, Winterflood again. This is one that intrigued me, Nick. Apparently, it is alleged that a military commander in France transmitted an order directly to the Guernsey Press, the local paper, making it clear that if anybody in German-occupied areas failed to comply with a demand for services required, they would be for the high jump, hard labour, a fine, and that was the death penalty. They appended the death penalty to everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
in the most serious cases.
Oh yeah.
That's they always like to put that bit in the most serious case, because we talked about this for the notices about escaping, didn't we?
Yeah,
where it says in the most serious cases. Well, it's quite binary. You're either escaping or you're not. I don't know how you have a serious one, but you were wondering about the fact that it said it was communicated directly. I don't know.
I can't imagine that somebody in France would send something to the Guernsey Press. Everything was routed through the local authorities.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I suspect there's a little bit of confusion here because quite often there were orders that were published that had come from the command in the north of France. So I think that's just where they got a bit confused.
Yeah.
So it would have come through the Feldkommandant here and just been, they might have reprinted it and said it was from, the commander in France, but it wouldn't have been wouldn't have been sent through directly to the Guernsey press.
No.
There'd have been no mechanism for doing that, for starters.
And now we have Mr. Sovry, or one of our other diarists. He records, he was a builder, carpenter and joiner, and he records being visited by a German officer who asks Sovry, could he supply a conveyance to take a body from Victoria Hospital to Fort George for noon, the 9th of March. Now, I look sort of, Sovry then gives an account of which was of some ceremony with the coffin being set up with large wreaths and swastikas. So Sovry had got this conveyance, picked the body up in the Victoria Hospital, and he suggests it's a bigwig in Sovry's opinion. So up at Fort George, the coffin is laid out with large wreaths and swastikas. Now, I looked up the records of the German deaths for those few days, and there were 3 in March before the 8th, and there was one at Victoria Hospital. Somebody had died there the 4th of March, a Sergeant Volkenant, aged 28, cause unknown. And then on the 6th, there was a Lance Corporal. He died at sea. He fell into the hold of a boat. And then on the 7th of March, another Sergeant Klutig, aged 26, died following a bicycle accident. So these are low-ranking officers that died in the days freeze. So what do we think was happening here in Fort George for a coffin to be set up with a lot of ceremony?
They did go in for quite big ceremonies for funerals, particularly earlier on in the war. As time went on, it became more difficult. Just even transporting the coffins, etc. They got kind of scaled back a bit, but they did have quite a bit of pomp and circumstance around funerals. I would think it's a little bit odd for it to be one of these sergeants. Initially, when you sent the notes through for the show, I thought, hang on a minute, is this the doctor that was killed in Sark? But no, it's not, because that's not until later on in 42. We'll talk about that when we get there.
I think it's Sergeant Volkenant, who it says here, he died at Victoria Hospital, which is pretty much backs up what Sovry is saying. It says cause unknown, it was all not recorded. So there's something a little odd there.
Like I say, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that it was a sergeant. I mean, that's, that was an important rank in the German army structure. The officers very much relied on their sergeants, a little bit like happens quite often in modern armies these days as well. Your senior NCOs are invaluable.
Yeah, well, I sort of did some research using Simon Hamill's excellent book about the German war dead, and I couldn't help but notice when I looked through German deaths in March, altogether there were 9 German deaths, but there were 3 separate suicides. Yeah,
it doesn't surprise me. Again, it's back to people were despairing. It's just a combination of things. So that people were despairing about what happened to their families if they'd got
back in Germany,
news that their families had, been, some members of their family had been killed in bombing, or they've just been listening to the news reports of bombings of Germany and things like that, and were getting depressed about that. Some of them, they're getting orders to go to the Eastern Front, and frankly would rather kill themselves than go to the Eastern Front.
Yeah, one poor individual apparently just jumped in the water from a boat that was going between Granville and Alderney, and just jumped in the sea.
Yeah,
and poor unfortunates there, as you say, getting bad news from home, and possibly notice that they can be sent off to the meat grinder in the Russian front.
There certainly are accounts where there are Germans that have basically said that they don't want to go to the Eastern Front, and the next day they walk into a minefield or something like that. There were 2 later on in the war who just walked into the minefield out at Tortwell, just in utter despair. I think that was possibly a combination of just utter despair at
I think starvation as well starts to play on
starvation. What was going on at home, the whole lot, and the 2 of them just walked into a minefield.
Right. Now, there is such a publication that comes out regularly called the Channel Island Occupation Society Review, which, as it says on the tin, is a review produced by the Channel Island Occupation Society. So what I've done is mined them. And in fact, mine them for information. Nick, I think I mentioned to you before, the very latest one's got an excellent index for looking back through previous copies. But I notice in March 1942, in the copy number 44, review number 44, there's a table of the loss of Allied aircraft around Guernsey, and they were during March 1942, there was a loss of a Lockheed Hudson north of Guernsey on the 15th of March. And now Lockheed Hudson was a light bomber?
Yeah, this one was from 233 Squadron, and the aircraft failed to return from an operational flight near the Channel Islands on the 15th of March. It was based at RAF Thorney Island, which was near Chichester. Thorney Island actually had quite a lot of connection with the Channel Islands during the course of the war. Before the Germans arrived, there were ants and aircraft that were used for training and observation that were quite often detached here from Thorney Island. Also, after the Germans had arrived, Thorney Island, again, you had Ansons and various other aircraft that were flying up and down between there and France and keeping an eye on what was going on around here as well. So, yeah.
Okay. Now, over to our Jersey correspondent, Mr. Lesota. What's he got to say about what's happening in Jersey?
Well, he's been up to all sorts. He's been up to a bit of mischief, but we'll come to that in a minute. Well, I found that quite amusing, the story that I'll tell you in a moment anyway. But on a more serious note, at the beginning of March, he's had a rather official and nasty reminder from the Germans of the consequences of refusing to supply goods to them, because he does at times try and mess things up for them by saying he hasn't got stuff when he has got it. Some of the Germans he just really doesn't like at all, even more so than the others. So he'll try not to deal with them. And again, we're back to our old friend. The notice finished off with, there'll be fines, imprisonment, and in the most serious cases, death. That just, I would imagine whoever typed up those notices probably could do the last couple of lines, with their eyes shut.
Automatic typing.
Because there was so much. So he was worried that as well, though, that the Germans, if he pushed it too hard, he might end up getting locked up or fined. But he was less bothered about that. But he was more bothered about the fact that they might actually try and take over his builders merchants that he was looking after, and that might screw things up. He also records rather sadly that, this is quite early on, 5th of March 42, that 5 slave labourers had died as a result of eating poisonous roots because they were that hungry. They weren't even getting, he records, they're just getting a watery soup, not even a few spuds, and that they were that desperate that they'd just dug up roots with their hands and eat them.
Yeah, he also reports here, he writes, I am sorry, too, for the raw recruits now undergoing military training. They are so young and so raw, they don't know what to do with their hands and feet. So he's got some feeling for the young German soldiers. Yeah,
he does, yeah. And he frequently refers to being, worried about some of the poor youngsters and whatever. He can tell they've just been forced into doing this effectively.
What's this? He made a bet. Is this the Soto?
Oh, yeah. So, well, this is later on in March, so 27th of March 42. He talks about their series of mock battles around their district, keeping them awake most of the night with machine gun and rifle fire, unfortunately all blanks. But he made a bet. Unfortunately for him, he's definitely not going to have been able to collect on this one, because he made a bet of £1 that the Union Jack would be flying here by June the 30th. So just 3 months later into 1942. So he said he finished his entry for that day with, so I hope the British Army doesn't let me down.
Yeah, there seemed to be this upsurging feeling that, the Germans are all going to be picked up by the British and sent off to Canada. And I think this must have been because of the fact the Americans are now in the war, on the right side this time. God knows what's going on at the moment. And also the fact that things aren't going well in in Russia as well. So there seems to be this belief that a corner had been turned.
Yeah.
But, there were still lots and lots of bad things to come. Are we sort of near the fall of Singapore out in the east? Something like that. I think yeah. And then more raids.
Yeah.
So he's finally sort of, has he got his bombing that he wanted?
No, they're not bombing Jersey. They're just passing through. If you've listened to the last few, probably about the last 4 episodes of the podcast, poor old Mr. Lesotho down in Jersey, he's very annoyed because the RAF's doing a bit of bombing of shipping and some the like around Guernsey, and Jersey's not getting bombed, and he's really, really annoyed about it. But again, he's still not getting bombed in Jersey, but he is getting kept awake at night because there are aircraft passing through. The Germans open fire with anti-aircraft guns of varying types and calibers. He records that there was a heavy burst at a plane which was flying homewards at 3 a.m. quite low. And he says, I imagine it was previously damaged, otherwise it wouldn't have been flying home.
Yeah, he employs this term "flaming onions." I haven't heard of that since I read the Biggles books.
Yeah,
55 years ago. Flaming onions, pom-poms, and heavy stuff. Yeah, so
there we go.
Is Lesotho's diary a published diary?
Yeah.
It can be.
You can get it on. It's even available on Kindle.
Okay, yeah.
I'll tweet a link out to it later.
Yeah, because I think
it's a great read.
Yeah,
just because he's got a bit of a wicked sense of humour, even when.
Okay, well, we're sort of sorry, Nick. Yeah, we're coming to the end of this episode.
I've got one more.
Oh, okay, yeah.
We almost forgot the funny story, which if I can get.
This is a Lesotho story.
Yeah, it is, and it's not on the sheet that I gave you. Actually, that's why we've probably just forgotten a bit. So, we were just saying he had a bit of a sense of humour and things. So he records that he is rather unpopular amongst certain of our neighbours. There are those in our immediate vicinity, 4 females with their husbands and families of 2 to 4 children, who regularly go out with the Germans. Some even have their amours home whilst their husbands are there. Don't tell me it isn't possible. It happens. And he says, now this is the bit I find quite amusing, and this will be why they're really, really not very happy with him. I've got into the habit of flashing a torch on these bright females when they are being walked home by their Germans.
Oh dear.
and have suffered the corresponding displeasure of the females and their escorts. In fact, some of the females on behalf of their Germans are threatening all sorts of unpleasantness for me. I have at least registered my disapproval of this fraternising with one's enemies, although I should prefer the methods which the Dutchman mentioned to me earlier this week, when he tells me that what they do in Holland is they get hold of the females, take them to a quiet spot and shave their heads.
Ah, okay. Yeah.
Now, there is... I'm not aware of any of that happening in terms of the shaving of heads in Guernsey, but there is, in one of the MI19 interviews with some of the escapees who escaped actually later in 42, they talk about the GUB, the Guernsey Underground Barbers.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so it may well have happened. I don't know. But
well,
I've not seen any accounts of it. No, but that was a play on the Glasshouse Utilisation Board, which was known as the GUB, and then they obviously decided to call it.
Well, we did have a German baby in our family, all Georgian. We'll get to that in due course. It's 1944. Okay, Nick. So it was all wind up here, but we've been going a year.
We have indeed. It was a year on Tuesday.
Last Tuesday, yeah. It was really quite extraordinary, and we had a wonderful piece by Simon Delarue in our local paper.
Yep.
Which was very, very gratifying. I think I said in the article, I did say in the article, it sounds rather grandiose, but we do get fan mail. We had a package sent to us, Nick, from Clive Fennessy, who does know Guernsey well, and hopefully he'll come back this year and we'll meet up with him. He sent us some postcards, a lovely letter, and a gift of an old Guernsey tourist brochure, which was fascinating with all the old hotels and bars. And so, Clive, thank you ever so much. And when you are here, hopefully with your good lady, we'd love to meet up with you and have a chat. So thank you ever so much for taking the time to write to us. If anybody wants to email us, Nick, we're occupied at gnetradio.com.
Correct.
That's us.
Yeah, and just a massive, massive thank you from us to everyone that's been listening to the podcast, everyone that's contributed. We do get people who write in, and we always name check people, unless they ask not to be name checked if they've got a snippet of info for us. I mean, I'm just looking at the stats now. We're at 9,325 downloads since we started a year ago. And it's been gradually creeping up, the amount of people that listen each episode. Thanks very much to our guests as well. I mean, we mustn't forget them. Steve Foot's been on, Tim Osborne, Leanne Markey, Teresa Laflemme. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody. Oh, Kerry Thomas, my friend Kerry from Wales, came on and talked about, what it was like for him coming here to visit for the first time and have a look around the occupation-related stuff.
And we
must all our guests. I can't remember.
Well, Tim Osborne, and we must get Tim in again soon, because he is very good on the Miras battery. Got people wanting to go there. Lots of the accredited guides, myself included, and you'll be working with Joe May. Lots of tours coming up, and in fact, this sort of prompts me to mention that next Sunday, that's Sunday the 23rd of February, for local people, if they want to join our tour that will be meeting up at Ecar Point. We'll be looking at the locations where the first spies came ashore. We'll be discussing the Ecar Strong Point and the peripheral resistance nest. We'll be going to the sites where some of these military sites were and still are. The ruins and what's left over are still visible. We'll also be going to visit the Loop Tower 14, the tower that was built in 1778, 1779, renovated by my brother and his friends. My brother will be there. The tower will be open. We'll be able to get a talk from my brother on the renovation process. If it's cold, he'll have the fire lit. We'll even be able to get up on top. And then we shall return to Ecar via La Marcherie, and I'll be talking about the Marcherie building that had been in the Hugo family and the Banks connection with that, Sir Donald Banks' brother particularly. So that will take about 2 hours. Go to www.guernseywalkingtools.com for further information, or you can get hold of me at keith@guernseywalkingtools.com on email. Yeah, so that's that. And anything that you've got going?
What have we got going on? I've just got a few bits and pieces going on. I'm working like Billy O, trying to get the book finished, which is going at a pace now, as I say, somewhat hindered by not being able to get to some of the archive information, but we're getting there. I've got a few other speaking engagements and things like that, which I can't really talk about at the moment. We're going to be out and about doing something later on, which I can't talk about at the moment, but we'll be able to probably fill you in on the next episode. We're going to be out and about at an event nearer to Liberation Day, so you might be able to catch up with us.
Yes, because this year is the 80th anniversary of our liberation, and there's lots going on. And if you're thinking of travelling to the island at any point during the year, not only in May this year, but please, we'd be very, very happy to meet up with anybody coming over to chat to them and show them.
You're already planning for what you're doing over the winter, aren't you? We haven't even finished this winter yet, and you're already. Well,
we've got to plan ahead, and tours. Not tours, talks. So I'll be putting a series of talks on. I booked some rooms at St Martin's Community Centre, and there'll be various talks, some World War II orientated, but not all of them. I'm building the website now, and if you go to the website www.guernseywalkingtours.com, you'll pick up some of the information. Best leave it till after the weekend, because I'm still working on the wording for that. But our time is up. So
yeah, one more thing to mention. We've had a brainwave. We're going to do. I'll put the details out on the social media and stuff, and we'll mention it next time. But we're going to do a Zoom Ask Us Any Questions thing, which could be interesting.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. Just the easy questions, please. No. Literally, it will be ask us anything you want to ask us about the occupation. We'll be putting out details of that over the next week or so. But that's a few weeks away yet before we do that. But we thought that might be a bit of fun, just as a way of saying thank you to everybody for listening as well.
Yep. Okay. So I think we're pretty much done. Don't forget to visit Gnet Radio. We have plenty of music shows that if you're into music, that should interest you. And Gnet Radio funded and sponsored by Guernsey Arts and www.guernseyarts.com or .gg or something. Sorry, I should have written that down. Okay, we've got to go. We're running late. Okay, so it's goodbye from Keith and
goodbye from Nick.
Goodbye.
Cheery.